What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some details on the reveal of the Blood of Dawnwalker, a single-player RPG from Studio Rebel Wolves, which was founded by ex-CDPR employees, and I will say right away that experience definitely shows, as everything about the trailer that was published yesterday alongside a big reveal showcase definitely has a lot of similar energy there, but the experience itself is shaping up to be quite different, but a few things right away. So what we got today was a trailer alongside a host of gameplay details without actually any gameplay. So they have a separate gameplay reveal set to release later in the summer, and I imagine we'll have more to talk about then. But for right now, this game takes place in an area of the Carpathians during the 14th century, a time of famine, plagues, and just general unrest. Capitalizing upon that, vampires sweep in and kill all of the local feudal lords before taking over the place, which brings up some interesting points later, but that's the general gist of it. Now, the trailer actually takes place 2 years before the events of the game itself, and that's important because during the interim there, when these vampires fully take over, they twist a whole bunch of how society works in order to suit their needs, but our character, Cohen, winds up also being turned into a Dawnwalker, which, as the name probably implies if you're ever familiar with any kind of vampire thing, is someone that is able to some extent walk during the day, but also has vampiric features. I would say probably something like a Dhampir is the closest thing to conceptualize, but the gist of it is Cohen worked in silver mines or something to that effect, and all of that as a result has built up some resistance to the vampirism, and thus he has not fully turned into a vampire and exists in a sort of in-between. Now that's important because apparently when we actually get to play the game, during the day we're going to be using things like swords and traditional weapons to fight enemies, but come nighttime, our vampiric powers are fully activated and we can essentially move through the game as a vampire, which I thought was an interesting take. But through the course of the game, Cohen's family ultimately winds up trapped by the leader of the vampires that we see in the trailer, Brensis. So our primary goal is to save our family, but it is apparently going to be very non-linear in our approach to that. But basically that's the goal, and how we get there is up to us. They described this as several paths through the game that will ultimately see you engaging or not acknowledging certain groups or pathways at all, leading to a host of different playthroughs that arrive ultimately at that central theme. And they even implied that primary goal itself might have different outcomes as well due to what happens on your journey along the way. Now, to make that more interesting, they have implemented, or will implement, I suppose, what I figure you could probably call a similar approach to the Persona games, or more recently Metaphor, where there is a day-night cycle, but it is predicated upon what you do. It's not necessarily tied to any real amount of time because the game takes place over 30 days and 30 nights. Time advances when you complete objectives and quests. So there's kind of a time pressure there, but realistically you're free to explore and do all sorts of other stuff as you please, and you have control over when that time is passing. And I would say right away, we'll see how that pans out. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing inherently, but it's a fine line to walk, and if you get it even a little bit wrong, it can lead to a bad time. So we'll see how it winds up, but it's something to be at least a little leery of at the moment. Now that's the primary stuff to know, but it did get a little more interesting through some of the things that they explained, basically about the game and its world building outside of the trailer. And probably the most interesting part of all of it was that when the vampire lords swept in and took over this place from the feudal lords, it wasn't like a black and white situation because of everything going on at the time. In some ways, these vampire lords really weren't any worse than the people they were replacing. And their leader, Brensis, took things like religious beliefs and general spirituality and twisted that in order to bend the humans to their will in a much more willing fashion. So what is happening here is that these vampires are actually ruling over the land, not all that dissimilar from the way a feudal lord would. Except in this case, all of the human beings are essentially treated as cattle, and every week, at events that they are calling blood mass, like a church gathering more or less, all of the humans gather for this mass only to be fed upon by the vampires, with punishment for things like actual crime being, death by being drained dry by one of these vampires as well. So in this way, they are effectively acting as cattle, feeding these creatures who have set up an entire system of governance in order to facilitate this situation, which I thought was especially interesting and probably the thing I like most about this. But we also have a few other things to talk about as well, because the vampires are monsters, sure, even if they're not necessarily worse than the people they replaced. You do have to remember that your character is ultimately, at least partly vampire, and as such is subject to hunger as well. And they even mentioned that if your character does not feed regularly, you might lose control and take that out on people close to you, going so far as to kill them inadvertently through your actions, or non-action, I guess. So there's that. A few other details though are there will be things like magic and the occult. Some people have turned to those because, as you might imagine, not every citizen is happy with this change to following vampires. Some go along with it because it's not much different than what they're used to, and they were just as prone to death otherwise, where other people and villagers obviously don't like it and have turned to things like the occult in order to find a way to fight back if they even can. Though they describe magic in this game more like natural phenomenon is, I believe, the words they used, as opposed to something a bit more direct. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that fits into it, especially given the roots here in things like Polish folklore. And what's more, they want Brincis to be a sort of active villain, reacting to the things we are doing and the activities we get up to, which means over the course of the month he will potentially set edicts that directly respond to whatever it is we're doing, which I think will be an interesting system to see played out. But that's not the only thing of note about these vampires. They talked about some of their visual design, because obviously vampires are one of those things that there's so much lore and folklore around that there's almost like a sort of grab bag of powers and things you could associate with them that any given media may choose to ignore or grab up. But in particular, they wanted to focus on the teeth here. So you can tell a vampire's age and status by its teeth in this world, as they never stop growing for them. So the older a vampire is, the longer and more teeth they have. And while most of them could pass as at least vaguely humanoid when their mouths are closed, the second they open up, their teeth sort of almost unfurl, which I thought was an especially interesting visual theme. Not least of which because the exact movement of these teeth that they showed remind me a lot of snake fangs, how their fangs tend to fold up when their mouth is closed. And I'd be curious to know if that was just a coincidence or something more specific. But they also mentioned that vampires aren't the only things we have to worry about. There are plenty of other creatures we will have to deal with, such as the undead. They even use kobolds as a potential threat. But as of right now, that's pretty much everything to know that was included in this trailer and the subsequent showcase where they talked about all of it. With that in mind, you might be wondering when this game releases. Obviously, they didn't have a release date for us, basically saying when it's ready, you'll know. But I would say, given that we're getting a gameplay reveal later in the summer, probably at Summer Game Fest or something like that, alongside the fact that they've apparently already been working on it for a couple of years in Unreal Engine 5, I would assume this is probably going to be like 2026 or maybe 2027. I'd be very shocked if we saw a release of this year. But it has certainly piqued my interest, and I suppose we'll see what happens with it. And thus, if you enjoyed this video or you're looking forward to hearing more about this game, by all means subscribe and stick around, as I will certainly be covering it more in the future. And that, of course, does in fact mean to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.